Well, thanks to Helen. I think she's doing a wonderful job really sort of digging down into the sort of niches and really looking forward to sort of giving our overview of everything that's going on in healthcare. And I think in blockchain, there's an interesting sort of Helen sort of referenced depression. Which I guess is good when you're at a healthcare conference to talk about a medical condition. But I think our researchers really got digging into what's going on within blockchain. I think the first thing to remember is there are just sort of huge numbers within healthcare. The scale of this opportunity for any tech vendor, but in blockchain especially, is massive. So you look at the pharmaceutical industry, it's a more than $1 trillion revenue business. Revenues from drug sales are roughly 10 billion. You've got sort of the medical records industry, roughly $11 billion industry, and the cost of just mapping the first human genome with the Human Genome Project was $1 billion. So I think as blockchain makes big inroads into the healthcare industry, this is going to be very, very exciting. So we've rounded up. I think this may be an old slide deck as well, Russell, because Alana changed to another one. But anyway, but our researchers have begun looking quite deeply in depth at the various sort of levels of activity that have been going on. But so I think just returning to look at this data. What we've begun to map quite significantly in depth is the general sort of various different consortia and the sort of areas of activity. So you've got the likes of Novartis, who have been sort of looking fairly in depth at what's been going on in the supply chain. You have Pfizer, you have Premier, you have McKesson. So these are extremely large sort of pharmaceutical groups that have moved in to look at what's been going on within the supply chain. You have MTBC, which has been working on blockchain and electronic health records. So what we've been uncovering is there's just a general sort of look at the sort of move towards various different proofs of concept and the like. So at the same time, you've got a number of different sort of groups like Amgen, Pfizer, Sanofi. You have the FDA that's been working with IBM and Merck. So what's been going on is a look at how you pull together the sort of various different use cases of the blockchain. So you have and in the presentation that we prepared, there's a breakdown of how the sort of elements of the sort of the nature of the distributed ledger allows you to look at particular sort of elements related to the sort of the trust and the truth. So, for example, we've had a significant sort of, at the same time, you've got the various different ambitious startups that have begun working on particular things. So you've got Simply Vital Health, which has won a grant from the US National Foundation. You've got the likes of MediConnect and UK Meds, which are working on tracking medication globally. And at the same time, you've got the likes of ExoChain that has begun looking at patient health data and working with individuals to control access to their medical records. So when we've been looking at the particular trends and we mapped various different consortia from the likes of IBM and others. So this is moving on to sort of our finalized presentation. But so in terms of where we've seen the industry moving is you have sort of significant costs related to fraud and the like. So this is sort of in terms of setting the picture for exactly what's been going on within healthcare. Is there's sort of roughly 3.5 billion of fraud taking place in the US, and those numbers have been rising dramatically. And what I would say is there's been sort of huge, lots of big movements to look at adoption within healthcare. So in terms of the penetration, what I think is quite intriguing is that for sort of standard company earning tools across other sort of general corporations, with the mentions of blockchain in sort of Fortune 1000 companies is huge. But within healthcare, it's still relatively early. So you've got the likes of the big healthcare providers are not talking about this issue as much as perhaps some of the wider industry. But what we're seeing is at the same time, this is an analysis of different mentions in sort of academic journals of the word blockchain, and you're seeing a sort of huge rise. So last year it went up sort of 4x in terms of how much people were talking about healthcare in scholarly journals, and then you're seeing that data talk about healthcare data, clinical trials. You've got biomedical research, but there's a whole gamut of things that people are talking about. At the same time, we're seeing a significant level of funding coming into particular startups. So there's been a sort of 3x rise to 650 million in terms of money being deployed into businesses in the field. And I think what we looked at I'm sure this is sort of everyone here really knows what a distributed ledger blockchain system is, but it's a digital architecture using a shared immutable ledger, looking at particular characteristics that helpful for healthcare, such as provenance, traceability, management of data, and allowing for security of that data through cryptography. So, and they're particularly interesting characteristics like smart contracts and DApps and cryptocurrencies. And I think in the context of healthcare, the blockchain is particularly interesting because it can work on these particular areas. So in provenance, it can help with the authenticity of healthcare records, allowing you to identify counterfeit drugs. You can look at the traceability, so you can look at supply chain management. I think the area of medical records is particularly exciting, and we sort of talked about identity and just you can imagine the sort of transformation that will go on with various different sort of healthcare technology infrastructures through being able to easily sort of layer the data, the sort of access of particular, how you trace the identity of particular people, and joining up their healthcare records and providing different levels of access. At the same time, you've got security, so the likes of clinical trials, patient consent. There's sort of novel approaches within the cryptocurrencies, so looking at rewards for sharing data, healthcare data, payment, these kinds of things. There's work on smart contracts to optimize business processes, and you've got things like blockchain and the Internet of Things, tracking the state of drug supplies in real time. I think it's still very early days, so there's a lot of industry pilots. The adoption is still early stage. We're seeing that sort of digital platforms don't necessarily allow for the easiest sharing of information, and then some participants, what we're seeing quite a bit is that the general sort of corporates don't necessarily want to share that much with their particular data sets. So there's obviously there's a conundrum of sort of getting a lot of these different parties to collaborate with each other, and then you're needing to look at how blockchains reflect different perspectives of consumers, patients, and regulators. So we've been sort of quite in-depth mapping the various different projects. So you've got the likes of Synaptic, which is looking at data directory accuracy and reducing maintenance. So this has got a sort of there's an incredible array of big corporates, the likes of United Healthcare, Humana. There's various different groups which are sort of gathering around these various different consortia. At the same time, you've got Melody, which has had significant sort of in-kind funding from the likes of Glaxo, McKesson, Novartis, Merck. So the sort of the big names within healthcare, and it's been looking at machine learning for drug discovery and federated learning, and the EU Innovative Medicines Initiative has been very supportive of this as well. And then IBM's also been making significant strides with its health utility initiative, so you've got significant corporates getting involved in that as well. We've also sort of looked at there seems Corda has got a couple of projects that it's been working on in ZKD3 and HS Blocked, while on Hyperledger there's been a particularly the Change Healthcare has been talking about the significant strides that it's made in terms of transaction processing, and claiming it's done 50 million transactions per day. We talked through some of this data a bit earlier, but there's some new startups moving into the field, and other projects by some of the big sort of pharmaceutical companies. So at the same time, there's significant funding for various different startups. So the biggest funding round we found for startups was to MediBlock, which has raised 60 million, but there's significant sort of early stage money being poured into different projects that are working in the field. At the same time, I think given that we're in Europe, there's perhaps heartening that we found like now 85 different healthcare startups within Europe, which is actually greater than the number of startups in North America, Asia, and Oceania. So in a conference in London, I think it's particularly heartening that that's happening. But of course, in terms of sort of active venture capital activity, the US is unsurprisingly leading the way in healthcare with sort of roughly 37 groups being funded. And you found sort of various different funding rounds in Singapore, Switzerland, and the UK. But perhaps knowing how hard it is to raise institutional venture capital, I'm sure this number, the sort of difference between the European numbers of the number of active businesses and what's being raised is perhaps unsurprising. But thanks once again to Helen for putting this group together. I'm really excited to hear about everything that's going on within healthcare, and very happy to sort of answer any questions in terms of what we've been finding in research within healthcare, or do feel free to get in contact if you want to understand a bit more about the trends data that we've been mapping.
I can just kick off with a follow-up question, which is, do you think it's the technology that is now missing, or do you think it's more about kind of change management process, and is that what's holding sort of the investors back from getting more involved in this?
So I think it's really interesting. I think there's probably, I'd say, the biggest barrier at the moment across all of blockchain, I think, is regulatory, really. I think the technology is very much, I mean, if you talk with all the vendors and the technologists, there's huge progress being made in terms of all the different sort of fields of blockchain, from the sort of private DLT blockchains like Corda and Hyperledger and Enterprise Ethereum. There's that is generally, like, when you try and drill down deep into looking at, if you look at, for example, the Change Healthcare project, it's doing 50 million transactions a day. I think where you're finding a degree of reticence among the big corporates is they don't want to commit too much to particular projects, because it's almost like they can get bitten quite badly by suddenly the regulatory change. If you look at, I mean, I guess the example of Libra is a classic one, right? How that got shot down by the Fed, and clearly Facebook sort of is making different moves there. And this obviously isn't talking about healthcare, but I think the basic problem is the same, is no one really knows what's going to happen on that front.
We have one or two questions? Okay.
Great, thanks, Helen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Toby.